Alright, so today we are going to talk about Chapter 9, Defending and Redefining the Nation, 1809 to 1832. In this chapter, there's actually kind of one of our longer chapters. There's 5 sections in this chapter, so we're going to talk about conflicts at home and abroad, national expansion and regional economies, economic and political crises, the expansion and limits of American democracy, and Jacksonian politics in action. So the first conflicts we're going to talk about are going to be tensions at sea and on the frontier. So President Madison, he had installed some efforts to avoid war, tried some things to avoid war with Britain and France, and one of those included the Non-Intercourse Act, which only limited trade with France and Britain and their colonies. This act did encourage the growth of U.S. manufacturing, and many citizens were troubled to see Congress limiting their right to trade. So we have that one, kind of dealing with international issues. And then on the frontier, we have problems in the Northwest Territory. And that gained a lot of attention when Tecumseh and Tezcatlipoca, they are Shawnee half-brothers. They created this Pan-Indian alliance in an attempt to resist white encroachments and white culture. Tecumseh and his brother is going to be known as the Prophet. They established a settlement known as Prophet Town. To further their efforts, they rejected a treaty obtained through questionable means by the territorial governor of Indiana, William Henry Harrison, that granted 3 million acres of Indian land to the United States for $7,600. And the reason that this is questionable is because what the white Anglo-Americans did is they actually went to men of the tribe, but not necessarily leaders of this Pan-Indian alliance, and got permission from them or got their signatures. And that is why the two brothers reject that tribe, or that treaty. Madison ordered Harrison to attack Prophet Town, and the destruction of the settlement really weakened that Pan-Indian alliance, and it also allowed the United States to direct its attention back to another threat of Great Britain. So the nation, it really became divided over the question of whether to go to war with Great Britain. New England merchants and Federalists, that's the political party, the Federalists, opposed war because it would negatively impact commerce, while others supported it because they believed Indian resistance in the West was due to British actions. They thought that the British were kind of antagonizing the Indians and encouraging them to continue kind of raiding frontier settlements. So President Madison, he attempts to avoid the war, but it does fail, and he compiled a list of grievances against Great Britain for Congress to consider. And also, he's getting some of this from the war hawks. These are young politicians that really want to go to war with Great Britain. And Congress is going to side with the war hawks and also with Madison, and they're going to declare war in June of 1812. The United States was very unprepared for war, both militarily and financially. Budget issues had reduced the nation's military resources. And if you go back and you look, President Jefferson had actually even reduced the size of the military during his presidency. And also tax revenues were low because of previous trading policies, and the National Bank's charter, it had expired, leaving the government with no significant source of credit. And so U.S. ideas about gaining British Canada met with defeat when British troops and their Indian allies overcame American troops along the U.S.-Canadian border. So unprepared for war, and then we have like a few losing battles at the beginning of the war, really proving that we were not ready to go to war just yet. Here's just a map of the War of 1812 for you. You can see Jackson's going to be down here in New Orleans, but you can see kind of their British in red, the Americans in the blue, all these different battles. So American victories are in blue, British victories are in red. And then also you'll notice this naval blockade, right? It's not going to be very good for us as far as trading and trying to getting supplies in. Also, it's going to hurt our national economy. So Madison, he ends up winning re-election in the fall of 1812 because he does have support in western and southern states. His defeat in New England and New York, though, that really demonstrated this sectional response to the war. They did not want to re-elect him. They didn't want to go to war in the first place. In U.S. victories in 1813, it really did little to encourage New England Federalists who they're going to continue to oppose the war. Some of those participants in a meeting of Federalists at Hartford, Connecticut in 1814, they actually proposed that New England secede from the United States, that they just altogether leave the U.S. and create a separate country. Others at the convention, they proposed a less radical plan to resecure Federalist power, and what their plan was, like, let's maybe pass some amendments limiting same-state secession to the presidency and restricting the length of those embargoes. A British invasion of the nation's capital in August 1814 temporarily lessened support for the war, but this defeat was followed by an American victory in Maryland and the expulsion of the British from New York and Washington. And we're going to talk about this battle, a correct view of the battle near the city of New Orleans. This is led by General Andrew Jackson. We're going to come back and talk about this battle in just a minute. But Andrew Jackson, his troops, along with their Cherokee allies, they defeated Creek Indians who were allies of Great Britain at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March 1814, and that resulted in the United States' acquisition of 2/3 of the Creek's land. The British defeated Napoleon in June of 1814, and that led really to this desire to end the war, right? They were fighting this war in the United States. They were also fighting it in the Napoleonic Wars. So when they finally defeat Napoleon, they're like, okay, we're tired. And Great Britain and the United States, they both are going to send representatives to discuss a peace settlement. And that resulted in the Treaty of Ghent. And that was signed on Christmas Eve of 1814. And that officially ended the war and restored both nations' pre-war land holdings. However, right, they're not in the United States when they sign this treaty, so word has to eventually get back to the U.S., and in the meantime, when we're waiting on news of the treaty, there's going to be some battles that continue. So news of the peace treaty doesn't reach the United States immediately, and in January of 1815, Jackson becomes a national hero for his successful attack on British troops in New Orleans, although it's officially after the war has ended. So that Battle of New Orleans, or the Battle of New Orleans, that's going to give him that national hero status. And he does have a lot invested in that. He was fighting during the Revolution. He was a very young boy when the Revolution broke out. And he's actually going to be captured and detained by the British. And a British officer wants Andrew Jackson, the boy, to clean his boots for him, to shine his boots one day. And Andrew Jackson refuses. And the British soldier actually ends up striking Jackson across the face and leaves a permanent scar on his face. You're not going to see this a lot in the portrait stone of Jackson. Just out of respect for him, they leave that scar out. But there are some that have the scar in there. So ever since the Revolution, he wants his revenge on the British. And he's going to take that out at the Battle of New Orleans. So keep that in mind too. While the United States achieved no territorial gains as a result of the peace treaty, the war does serve to bolster U.S. prestige internationally, and it ended British Indian alliances along the western frontier. The loss of Great Britain as their advocate left Indian tribes vulnerable to continued U.S. expansion. Let's talk about that national expansion and regional economies after the war. So following the War of 1812, population growth in the West, it really fueled demands for internal improvements and encouraged a larger role of the federal government. So we're going to see steamboats increasing trade on the Mississippi River and the development of the federally funded Cumberland Road. And that really is going to help to increase trade between the Ohio River Valley and northeastern seaports. However, President Madison is going to end up vetoing bills that would fund additional federal transportation projects. Democratic Republicans began to applaud the expansion of the federal powers in the first few decades of the 19th century. Henry Clay, a Democratic Republican representative from Kentucky, he advocated the American system, which called for increased federal funding for internal improvements, federal tariffs to protect manufacturing, and also a national bank. Congress negotiated with the Osage tribe in the West to secure right-of-way for merchants. The Santa Fe Trail became a major commercial route between the United States and Mexico. The Erie Canal, funded by tolls, linked the Mohawk River to Buffalo, New York, cutting time travel and transportation costs and connecting western farmers to eastern markets. Subsequent canal systems connected interior portions of the United States to the coastal states, allowing for increased trade and creating new commercial and manufacturing centers inland. Let's talk about expanding the nation's border and how that happens under James Monroe. He wins the 1816 presidential election and improved U.S. relations with the British, secured the U.S.-Canadian border at the 49th parallel, and established joint U.S.-British occupation of Oregon through treaties negotiated by John Quincy Adams. To secure the nation's southern border, Monroe sent Andrew Jackson to push the Seminoles back to Florida, but he instructed General Jackson not to instigate conflict with Spain in the region. Jackson's going to ignore Monroe's orders, and he followed the Seminoles deep into Florida, attacked 2 Spanish forts, and executed 2 British citizens. Although outraged by Jackson's attacks, both Great Britain and Spain moved to quell any further conflict with the United States, and in the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, Spain ceded all of its land east of the Mississippi River and relinquished its claims to Oregon Territory. In an attempt to limit European expansion in the Western Hemisphere, Monroe quickly recognized new independent governments in Central and South America, and he declared the Western Hemisphere to be part of the U.S. sphere of influence, a policy that became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, the Monroe Doctrine was issued in 1823 and basically stated that the Western Hemisphere was closed to further colonization by European empires. So you could keep the colonies that you had, but you couldn't create any more colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Just to give you an idea here, all this in red, these are the major roads. Right, here's the National Road. Actually, National Road is down here from Washington, D.C. all the way out here to St. Louis. You'll notice here in green the major canals. This is the Erie Canal. You'll notice it goes, here in New York, all the way across New York, dumps out into the Lake Erie, And then some of these navigable rivers also, like ones that you can go up and down that are easy. You'll notice some of these rivers, that there's rivers in these states, but that doesn't mean that they can navigate on them very easily. So really linking east to west and north to south. U.S. citizens, traders, merchants, and manufacturers established relationships with these newly independent Mexican territories, and some Americans even ended up moving to Mexican lands. American merchants also expanded across the Pacific, opening trade with China and seeking additional markets in Hawaii. American manufacturing increased as a result of this expanded trade. It's like about regional economic development. While the American system helped unify the nation through transportation connections, it also reinforced distinct regional economies, labor systems, and political priorities. The growth of cotton industry in the South meant that planters continued to expand onto Indian lands, taking with them slavery and a dependency on northern manufactured goods. The increased importance of the cotton industry did not benefit all of Southerners, and the Madisons and other Virginia plantation families found that soil erosion limited their profits from tobacco and made a change over to cotton cultivation impossible. Some Virginia planters sold slaves to make money in light of this economic change. The cotton industry benefited other Southern planters and small farmers and provided benefits to Western farmers who sold their food products to Southerners and to Western towns that served as a regional commerce center. Northerners also increased their connections with Southerners, opening cotton warehouses, establishing trade agreements, and opening more factories and mills that turned Southern cotton into other products. Northerners traded goods with Western farmers for food, products, strengthening ties between those regions as well. But then we're going to have a little panic, the Panic of 1819, and that resulted primarily from reckless bank practices, including questionable loans and an overall decrease in U.S. exports. The directors of the Second Bank of the United States, also known as the BUS, tightened credit to branch banks in 1818, forcing banks to call in loans from individuals. The effects of this revealed the chain of indebtedness throughout the nation, as factory owners laid off workers, merchants reduced their orders, and businesses and individuals faced bankruptcy and foreclosures. Cotton farmers were hit especially hard in the Panic of 1819, and many lost their land to banks. When state banks failed, the BUS was left holding mortgages on Western lands. As Congress, manufacturers, and ordinary Americans debated how to combat the effects of the panic, working men, small farmers, and frontier settlers suspected that the concerns of merchant bankers, planters, and manufacturers attracted more attention from politicians. The panic was over by 1823, but it left a lot of Americans with a distrust of banks and federal authority. Some political crises that are happening, it comes up when we talk about slavery in Missouri. So Missouri is going to apply for statehood in 1819, and Congressman James Talmadge Jr. proposed that its admission to the Union hinge on gradual emancipation and a ban on future imports of slaves. So we're going to gradually get rid of slavery in this area. Southern representatives defeated this proposal, so Northern congressmen rejected Missouri's application. Southern politicians wanted to maintain the balance of power in the Senate between free and slave states, since Northerners had the majority in the House of Representatives. Thus, Southern senators blocked Maine's admission as a free state. Southerners equated slavery's expansion with slavery's future and worried that divisions among whites over slavery would fuel slave rebellions. Representative Henry Clay's compromise admitted Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state and established latitude 3630 as a boundary line between free and slave states throughout the Louisiana Territory. The Missouri Compromise calmed tensions for the moment, but the debate that preceded it revealed how quickly the nation could divide over slavery. So basically, this is the Missouri Compromise line. And what they said is, okay, all this territory that we got from the French, all this Louisiana territory that's ours, you cannot have slavery to the north of it, with the exception of Missouri. Missouri got to come in as a slave state, but everything else, once it becomes a state, it has to be free. Everything to the south of this line can come in as a slave state. That doesn't leave a whole lot of territory to be slave down here. For the time, it's going to kind of bring calm for a few decades, but we're going to go to war with Mexico and we're going to start gaining all of this area as well. So then the question is going to come up again. Well, what do we do with this new territory that we've gained? Is it free? Is it slave? Do we extend this all the way out? What's going to happen? So we're going to have a couple of new other acts that come into play, like the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850. Those are going to be really important in establishing slavery in the South and in the North. Let's talk about some more, or the expansion and limits of American democracy. We're going to talk about expanding voting rights. So while few people voted in presidential elections during this time, state and local political events, they drew large crowds, and you're going to even see some female participants. And the Panic of 1819, that really convinced many laboring men to demand suffrage as a way to get politicians to respond to their concerns. And some politicians, like Martin Van Buren, he was a Democratic Republican, he fought for universal white male suffrage. Like, you don't have to own property, that kind of thing. But others, including Daniel Webster, argued that suffrage should be based on property qualifications. By the end of the 1820s, most Atlantic seaboard states had lowered or eliminated property qualifications. Let's face it, there just wasn't any land out in the East. And joining Western states that had allowed for universal white male suffrage since their founding. So kind of it's right in the middle. That's where we're seeing a lot of issues with male suffrage. The expansion of the electorate did not extend to non-white males, nor did it extend to females. Women and African American males even lost their limited voting rights in some of those northern states. Proponents of African American disenfranchisement justified it with racist arguments, and their justifications won out. So when we talk about disenfranchisement, that means taking the vote away. So you have to remember there were free blacks kind of sprinkled throughout the North and a few in the South. They could vote before. A lot of them did own property. But now we're going to start to see that disenfranchisement taking away that right to vote from those black property owners. Congress joined northern and southern state legislators in passing legislation that limited African American rights. So we're going to take away your right to vote, and now we're going to start limiting your rights even more. And whites are going to use violence to terrorize blacks in order to keep the racial power structure in place. Denmark Vesey, he was a free slave living in Charleston, South Carolina. He was accused of plotting to free the city's slaves. He and 34 other men were hanged after being found guilty despite scant evidence. Mob violence against African Americans occurred in northern cities as well, driving some free blacks northward into Canada. Federalists had once fought for black rights. They had declined in power by the 1820s, and Democratic Republicans did not pick up the fight. Democratic Republicans became divided over the issues of federal authority and how strictly to interpret the Constitution, with younger politicians like Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson favoring a limited federal power. In 1824, the Democratic Republicans split into two parties, the Democrats and the National Republicans. The Democratic-Republican Congressional Caucus fractured into four camps, each with its own nominee for the presidency: John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and Andrew Jackson. Adams, who favored tariffs and internal improvements, and Jackson, who advocated limited federal power, became the two frontrunners. Jackson, he had this appeal to small farmers and laborers because he portrayed himself as a man of the people. Although Jackson won the popular vote, no candidate had an electoral majority, and the vote was sent to the House of Representatives. There, Henry Clay encouraged his supporters to back Adams, and Adams won as a result. Jackson accused Adams and Clay of making a corrupt bargain when Clay became Adams' Secretary of State. So it seems like, hey, Adams went to Henry Clay and was like, hey, if you get me in the presidency, I'll give you a favor back and I'll make sure you're on my executive cabinet. All right, so that's known as the corrupt bargain. Adams was unable to implement his agenda due to Van Buren blocking him in Congress and John Calhoun, his Southern vice president, opposing his policies. Adams was able to pass a tariff, though, on raw materials in 1828 due to Jackson and Van Buren's support, who believed the tariff would benefit frontier farmers. The tariff was Adams' only substantial legislative accomplishment, and he went into the 1828 election vulnerable to the growing power of Jackson's supporters. So in 1828, Jackson and Adams again ran against each other using new techniques to appeal to the electorate. Van Buren organized a national campaign for Jackson that appealed to a wide group of Americans. He was helped by John C. Calhoun, who was running as Jackson's vice president. Jackson toured the nation during the campaign, rallying support from different groups with kind of these vague and conflicting promises regarding the 1828 tariff. Adams' supporters launched personal attacks on Jackson and his wife, Rachel, accusing her of adultery and bigamy. So Rachel Jackson, she was married before, but her and her husband were estranged. They hadn't been living together or even seeing each other for a very long time. And she meets Andrew Jackson, and they fall in love, and they actually go into territory and get married before she's actually divorced. So it creates like this huge scandal in New York that she's this adulteress, so she's married to two different women, and it does kind of taint Jackson's reputation. And that's going to come back, and it's going to kind of haunt Jackson during the Petticoat Affair when he does become president. Jackson is able to appeal, though, and he carried all region except for New England. And what we see in the 1828 election, it marked the official split of the Democrats and the National Republicans. Those two parties are going to officially split. They're not going to be together anymore. And it introduced future campaigning techniques. So here you can see the 1824 election. You've got John Quincy Adams. You've got Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. And what Henry Clay does is he tells his 37 electoral votes, he's like, hey, go vote for J.Q. Adams, John Quincy Adams, and, you support him, we'll get what we want, because we don't want Jackson in. And so that's why it's known as the corrupt bargain, because those 37 votes end up going to John Quincy Adams. Then in 1828, you can tell the split here. Andrew Jackson comes back and he wins overwhelmingly the electoral votes. He wins, 11%, 56% over John Quincy Adams. And just like his father, John Adams, they both only serve one term. They only serve 4 years. Jackson's inauguration, it was attended by throngs of boisterous supporters from different backgrounds. Basically, they had a huge party at the White House, and the crowd continued its rowdy celebration inside the White House. While Jackson and his supporters viewed such celebrations as symbolic of the expansion of democracy through an increase, this more and more men are able to vote, others viewed the unruliness as dangerous and kind of as this precursor of mob rule. Jackson's controversial choice of John Eaton as his Secretary of War made another split between Jackson and traditional leaders. Eaton's wife drew the ire of Washington wives, and Eaton was eventually forced out of office in what became known as the Petticoat Affair. Eaton's resignation was followed by the resignations of Jackson's entire cabinet, and Jackson came to rely instead on informal advisors known as his kitchen cabinet. Jackson implemented the spoils system, giving federal appointments to loyal supporters. Jackson drew from different groups with competing interests, but his vetoes of internal improvement bills fractured that support, pleasing some and angering others. Southern agriculture was suffering due to soil exhaustion and because of the 1828 Tariff of Abominations, which Southerners hoped Jackson would reduce. Jackson and his president, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, disagreed on the concept of nullification, which Calhoun advocated as an assertion of states' rights in the light of the tariff. Northerners opposed nullification while Southerners supported it, and Jackson lost some Southern support by opposing it. After Jackson signed into law an 1832 tariff passed by Northern and Western congressmen, South Carolinians approved an ordinance of nullification, and y'all, in 1832, they threatened to leave the U.S. They threatened secession. The tariff issue and the renewal of the Bank of the United States, or the Buss Charter, became the defining issues of the 1832 election campaign. With the hopes of dividing the Democratic Party before the 1832 election, Jackson's opponents pushed for an early renewal of the Buss Charter. The tight money policies of the Buss earned support from Northern merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs, as well as Southern planters, but most Americans disliked the bank. Congress approved the charter renewal, and Jackson vetoed it, but rather than dividing the Democratic Party, his veto served to rally his supporters and helped him win re-election. In 1833, Jackson secured passage of a force bill which authorized him to use military to enforce national laws in South Carolina. To avoid military conflict over nullification, though, Jackson began working to reduce the tariff. One of the last things that Jackson's going to do in office is going to involve Indian removal. So Jackson supported removing tribes from their lands to gain land for white settlers. He opposed Indian sovereignty even for tribes that had assimilated. Basically what he comes out and says to the American public is, and to Indians, you guys, we're going to move you out of your eastern territory, move you west, and it'll be better for everyone. We're going to put you on these western lands that Easterners don't want, and there you can continue your way of life. Southern states demanded federal assistance to remove Indians from their land. The Cherokee Nation, they declared itself sovereign, but Jackson and the state of Georgia did not recognize the sovereignty, kind of said that they were a nation within a nation. The Cherokees opposed the Indian Removal Act, which sought to remove Indians from their land. Jackson's going to end up using military force to remove Indians. While some tribes fought back on the battlefield, the Cherokees, led by John Ross, they fought removal through the court system. They actually go in and appeal to the Georgia State Court, and they win. But they end up, Jackson doesn't recognize that, and he ends up forcibly removing them on what you guys have come to know. Eventually they'll be removed. It's not under Jackson's presidency, it's actually under President Monroe. It's known as the Trail of Tears. And we will talk, I think we talk more about that in the next chapter. So stay tuned for that.